This video will provide a brief definition and explanation of core concepts and figure types used by the ARMOnline platform. The video will help users to interpret core variables and figure types. Specifically, I will introduce the figure type boxplots and define the core concepts gross margin, profit, and downside risk. This slide explains the meaning of boxplots. The ARMOnline platform allows you to evaluate the performance of cropping strategies across multiple decades of weather records. However, when one looks at hundreds of crop yield values from different years, it is difficult to understand directly how frequently yields were low or high. In that context, boxplots are extremely useful because they provide us with a fast overview of how yields varied across many years. An example of the boxplot is here displayed on the left-hand side. The vertical axis gives us the crop yield range, and in our example, the axis ranges from 0 to 8,000 kilograms per hectare. The first thing we are interested in is the blue box in the center of the figure. It indicates the range of the central 50% of yield observations. In our example, in 50% of all years, crop yields were lying between 2,900 kilograms and 4,200 kilograms. This gives us a good understanding of the yield range that we should expect in years that have about near normal weather conditions. If we are interested in some more detail, we can also have a look at the red center line, which indicates the average yield across all years. Instead, the black center line just below indicates the median yield, which means that in exactly half of the years we observe yield values that are below the black median lines, and in the other half of years we observe yield values that are above the black median line. The next part of the figure that we are interested in are the dotted lines that extend from the central box, and they are also referred to as the whiskers. Each of them shows the yield range during an additional 20% of years. Accordingly, the dotted lines can be interpreted as showing the typical yield range in good years, being the dotted line above the box, and in bad years being the dotted line below the box. The last element of interest are crop yields that are more extreme than the dotted lines, so outside of the whiskers. In only 5% of years, crop yields are above the upper whisker, and in additional 5% of years, crop yields are below the bottom whisker. This can be interpreted as those yields that are expected in very good and very bad years. The next concept we are interested in is the definition of gross margins and profits. In this figure, starting from the left-hand side, we first see how much revenue was generated from crop sales. So in our example, that would be $7,000 per hectare. If we account for all variable costs that we occurred due to, for example, purchasing and applying fertilizer and pesticides, to name just two variable costs, and here in our example, those would account for a total of $3,000 per hectare, then we would derive a value of $4,000 per hectare of gross margin. The gross margin thus indicates how much is left of the revenue after subtracting all the variable costs. If further on we would account for all the costs secured for fixed costs, so for our machinery, for sheds and further fixed costs, which in our example here is accounted for by $2,200 per hectare, then we would arrive to a total profit value of $1,800 per hectare. Thereby these numbers are purely hypothetical to provide us with an easy numeric example. It is important to notice the conceptual difference between gross margin and profit, and throughout the ARMOnline platform we most commonly use gross margin as a reference point. The reason being that the fixed cost structure varies very strongly between farm types and locations, and accordingly profit values are not easily comparable across farms. Instead, gross margins provide a more transparent reference point that can more reasonably be compared across farms, and also it requires less complex data accounting, as costs for machineries, sheds, and other farm infrastructure wasn't available as part of the tool development. The last concept we're interested in is the concept of downside risk. All cropping strategies experience reductions in gross margins during poor seasons. However, this reduction is bigger for some cropping strategies than for others, and it's very useful to have quantitative measures of this sensitivity towards bad weather conditions. This is what the concept of downside risk provides us. To calculate it, we first quantify the average gross margin in the 25% of worst years. In addition, we define a minimum threshold of gross margin that we want to observe in order to have a certain level of resilience and sufficiency of income. We define that as being either $250 per season or $500 per hectare per year. The downside risk measures how strongly we drop in the worst 25% of years below this minimum threshold. Specifically, the downside risk is calculated as the subtraction of the average gross margin in poor years from the threshold gross margin, which we defined as $250 per season.